Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on quite an extraordinary deep dive. We're looking into a collection of very vivid firsthand accounts.
That's right.
These come from someone we'll refer to as the buyer from the World Succession Deed 1400.
Mm-hmm.
And this deep dive, it really focuses intensely on their prolonged and often, well, harrowing experiences inside a facility they describe as uh, Blacksite Berlin, or sometimes penal psychiatry.
Yeah, those terms themselves are pretty loaded.
They really are. And this isn't just a story. It's described as an intensely personal recounting of years spent in what the buyer explicitly calls a camouflaged secret prison.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is the intricate context the buyer provides for this facility. It's not just a prison in their telling.
Oh, not at all.
They frame Blacksite Berlin as this place where personnel, well, purportedly act alternately on behalf of the German, American, and Russian states.
All three.
Yeah, all operating supposedly under the guise of an international deep state. That's the framework presented. So our mission today, really, is to meticulously unpack the buyer's recounted experiences. We want to understand the what and the why of their time within this facility.
Exactly.
And crucially, we're basing this solely on the material provided to us. We'll be connecting these individual experiences, these moments, to broader principles, control, institutional dynamics, the psychological impact of these extreme environments.
Definitely. And you should get ready to hear some truly remarkable details and insights here. This isn't just a chronological list of events.
No, far from it.
It's a journey into a world where, according to this account, personal liberty is constantly under siege, and the struggle for just basic autonomy becomes a daily battle.
Mm-hmm.
We'll walk through these events with you, trying to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from the buyer's unique perspective, really helping you grasp the profound implications of their ordeal as they describe it.
Let's do it.
Okay, so to begin, the buyer's account immediately plunges us into just this profound state of isolation.
It really does. That's the first thing that hits you.
Imagine being held for over a decade. A decade. With virtually no external contact. What truly stands out to me is just the sheer mind-boggling duration.
10 years is. Yeah. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It really is. Such an extensive period. It's genuinely challenging to fully comprehend the psychological weight that must carry.
Absolutely.
Now, the buyer explains that initially, in the early stages of their confinement, there was supposedly an option for monthly visits from their mother.
Okay, so there was some hope initially.
Exactly. It wasn't just a vague possibility. It was apparently a communicated option that set an expectation.
Right.
But the stark reality, as recounted, was a cruel contradiction. This option was systematically denied for over 10 years.
Over 10 years. Wow.
That's just a staggering amount of time without that basic comfort, the connection of seeing a loved one. It stretches way beyond simple confinement into what sounds like deliberate psychological privation.
It does. It feels targeted.
And the denial wasn't just passive neglect or bureaucracy. No. The buyer recounts being explicitly told point blank that if they wanted to see their mother in person, they would have to initiate legal action. Basically, sue.
Sue to see their own mother.
That's how it was presented, according to the buyer. And they didn't perceive this as, like, a legitimate pathway. Not at all.
How did they see it then?
As a strategic, manipulative ploy by the facility. The perceived goal. To gain further jurisdiction over the buyer, to entangle them even more deeply within the facility's legal framework.
Using the legal system against them, essentially.
Precisely. And the psychological pressure didn't stop there. The buyer vividly recalls a caretaker making this really provocative, emotionally charged statement.
What did they say?
Suggesting that if the buyer didn't pursue this legal action to see their mother, it would imply, well, a fundamental lack of love for her.
Oh, that's low. That's incredibly manipulative.
Absolutely. The buyer unequivocally characterized that interaction as clear extortion. It just highlights these insidious emotional and psychological tactics reportedly used within this controlled environment.
Yeah, weaponizing that core relationship, the bond with a parent. It speaks volumes about the nature of the facility and its methods of control, as described here.
It really does.
And this profound manipulation, using family connection for what sounds like bureaucratic gain, it really illustrates a critical function of what sociologists sometimes call total institutions.
How so?
Well, it highlights the weaponization of emotional vulnerabilities to maintain absolute control. It's a classic tactic, really. You erode an individual's sense of self, their will, make them more pliable.
Like break them down.
Exactly. And the deliberate long-term denial of human connection, especially those really deep familial bonds, it's a well-documented cause of profound psychological distress. It significantly impacts mental state.
Makes sense.
And that process can render individuals more susceptible to the controlling narratives, the demands of their captors, or in this case, the institution.
So from the buyer's perspective,
From the buyer's perspective, the objective seems to be a fundamental re-engineering of their psychological landscape, turning their deepest attachments into instruments of their own subjugation. It's quite chilling when you frame it that way.
it really is. Okay, so the next phase of the buyer's experience, it actually reveals a surprising twist.
Oh.
After more than a decade of this intense isolation and what sounds like emotional manipulation, a visit finally did happen.
After 10 years. Wow, okay.
But, as you might expect, in a place described as penal psychiatry, it occurred under intensely stringent and controlled conditions.
I can only imagine. What were the details?
The buyer vividly describes the setting. A very small room in the WSH. Now, our sources don't give more context on WSH, unfortunately, but very small room paints a picture.
Confined, claustrophobic, probably.
Right, and crucially, the atmosphere was anything but private. The room was populated by no fewer than 5 staff members. 5, forming this silent, watchful audience.
5 staff for one family visit. That's excessive.
That's what it sounds like. This group included 2 psychologists, one from the buyer's station, another from the mother's station, and each psychologist was accompanied by 2 nurses.
So a psychologist and 2 nurses for each person being visited.
That's the setup described. And the buyer recounts how all 5 of these individuals positioned themselves in a row, directly in front of them, maybe about 2 meters away.
So close.
Intently listening, observing their entire conversation. The buyer's description is pretty evocative. They said they were sitting like chickens on a perch.
Wow, that paints a stark image, dehumanizing almost.
It does. And this deliberate setup, it fostered this environment of immense discomfort. It made any genuine, free-flowing, or intimate conversation utterly impossible.
Of course. How could you speak freely?
Exactly. As the buyer explicitly states, under that kind of pervasive scrutiny, they could only exchange harmless things. They had to meticulously avoid anything of true personal significance or emotional depth. It effectively sterilized the interaction, removing any chance for real connection.
And what's particularly illuminating here, based on the account, is the explicitly stated purpose of these meticulously orchestrated encounters.
Right, because it wasn't therapy, was it?
No, the buyer clarifies neither they nor their mother were undergoing any form of therapy at that time. Instead, the true intention, as they saw it, was a covert psychological assessment and evaluation.
Okay.
They even framed it as an eat-or-die situation.
Meaning?
The implied choice was stark. Either you consent to this constant, intense observation and assessment by numerous staff members, or you completely forfeit the rare chance to see your mother.
That's an impossible choice.
It really is. It demonstrates the systemic approach that leverages deep emotional bonds, not to help, but to maintain control and gather intelligence, rather than genuinely facilitating human connection.
Am the buyer.
Faced with this untenable choice, the buyer reluctantly acceded to these terms. They went through with the visits under these conditions.
And the observations from these visits.
Well, the observations from these 2 meticulously monitored visits, which were spaced about 6 months apart, were similarly calculated, according to the account. Notably, the fact that the interactions were described as unaufgerect,
Which means?
unagitated, or calm, that observation was later essentially weaponized.
How?
These observations were then incorporated into the annual clinic statement provided to the court. That's a critical document for the yearly hearing on continued confinement.
Ah, so even the lack of agitation was used against them.
Precisely. It clearly illustrates how every interaction, no matter how personal, was apparently repurposed for the facility's own objectives in justifying the buyer's ongoing detention. This process really highlights how institutional narratives get constructed, often, at the expense of individual autonomy and basic privacy.
It's a chilling picture of constant evaluation. And this relentless observation, it also spilled over into everyday life, didn't it?
Yeah.
It profoundly shaped even mundane events like a routine raid.
Exactly. Even within this highly controlled environment where every interaction feels like a performance for assessment, these unexpected events could suddenly shake things up.
And they invariably revealed what?
The constant state of vigilance and surveillance that permeated every single aspect of the buyer's existence, as they describe it.
Yeah. The buyer vividly recounts one such disruptive incident, which they actually term the Grand Raid on the station.
The Grand Raid sounds serious.
It does. Imagine waking up one morning, your station is suddenly just swarming with police officers. All patients immediately searched, then escorted from their cells into the courtyard.
Okay, so a major security operation.
Definitely not minor. The buyer describes a significant deployment of personnel. You had uniformed police, specialized dogs trained for phones and drugs, the regular caretakers, and even, get this, a special Blacksite unit.
Specific Blacksite unit for room searches.
Their sole explicit purpose, according to the account, was thorough room searches. And understandably, many patients were gripped by concern, anxiety. The buyer notes that maybe 1 in 3 patients possessed unauthorized items.
Mostly phones.
Primarily mobile phones, or maybe mobile routers connected to game consoles for Wi-Fi internet access. But beyond those, numerous other prohibited items were apparently stashed away in various nooks and crannies.
So a lot of potential contraband.
Right. So the patients, enduring what the buyer called a palpable queasy feeling, spent a grueling 5 hours stuck in the courtyard while this extensive raid went on.
5 hours. And what was the official reason given?
The alleged reason provided for this massive operation was the search for a missing sharp knife from the VZ. Again, VZ isn't elaborated on in our source material.
Okay.
This knife was supposedly later located not during the raid itself, but in the hydro on the station. Another term not fully defined for us.
So the raid didn't even find what they were supposedly looking for?
Apparently not. But this elaborate show of force, even for an item seemingly found elsewhere later, it really underscores the pervasive intensity of the security and the constant threat of discovery that defined life within Blacksite Berlin, according to the buyer.
Yeah, this scenario raises some important questions, like what's the true efficacy of such a large-scale operation versus its function purely as a display of power? Or maybe a psychological tool.
Good point.
The fact that the knife was allegedly found in a separate location, not during these extensive searches, it does strongly suggest a potential pretext for the raid, rather than a genuine recovery mission.
Right. The justification seems shaky.
And the details around the accidental discovery of that one phone by a dog. Yet the remarkably limited overall success in finding widespread contraband, even though its prevalence was acknowledged.
Yeah, it doesn't add up efficiency-wise.
Exactly. It points to a highly resourced operation yielding remarkably low tangible returns. However, the psychological impact on the patients, that would have been profound.
How so?
Well, an event like that serves to constantly remind individuals of their absolute lack of privacy and the overwhelming, arbitrary power of the institution. It doesn't matter what they actually find, the message is sent.
Intimidation.
It's a classic tactic in total institutions. You enforce compliance through intimidation and the constant reinforcement of authority.
But, despite this massive show of force, the buyer recounts some really fascinating details about how patients, with surprising resilience and ingenuity, actually managed to circumvent the rules.
Ah, the resistance element.
Yeah, it highlights this kind of underground resistance within the Blacksite. The raid itself, despite the vast resources deployed, yielded surprisingly limited tangible success.
We mentioned the one phone found by accident.
Exactly. The buyer specifically points out that only one phone was found, and purely by chance. A police officer threw a dummy phone into a room, trying to give the dog a little win,
A morale booster for the dog.
Apparently. But the dog ignored the fake and went straight for a real phone hidden there. Serendipity, not systematic detection.
Incredible. And the consequences for the patient caught.
Surprisingly minor, according to the buyer. Turns out, this patient was remarkably well equipped. He didn't just have that phone, he also had a mobile router and a second phone hidden elsewhere in his room.
So losing one wasn't catastrophic for him.
Not really.
Yeah.
And his outings, the Ausgenge, that privilege he had, the 1.3 ratio thing, which he'd apparently enjoyed for 13 years, they were merely suspended for a few weeks.
Just a few weeks after 13 years of outings.
Yeah. As the buyer recounted, with maybe a hint of irony, it was no big deal.
That's unexpected. It suggests either inefficiency or maybe even a strange kind of tolerance.
It's hard to say. It does suggest a system that, despite these grand displays of power, maybe wasn't perfectly sealed. It created this unexpected gray area for patients.
And the scale of contraband?
Widespread. The buyer confirms many phones were cleverly hidden everywhere. Some patients even carry them on their bodies,
Wow.
ingeniously tucked into their underwear at the crotch, an area where, apparently, pat-downs weren't conducted.
Exploiting blind spots in security. Resourceful.
Very. And in a particularly poignant act of solidarity, the buyer recalls an instance involving an elderly patient.
Yeah.
This patient had been confined for about 40 years, severely limited mobility, and he entrusted the buyer with his phone to hide during the raid.
And did they manage?
Yes. The buyer acted quickly, discreetly, and successfully concealed the device in the laundry room, hidden among clean mops. It stayed safe throughout the raid.
Wow. That speaks to a certain camaraderie, maybe.
It seems so. Reflecting on the whole operation, the buyer characterized the raid quite bluntly. A huge deployment of manpower without any success. Completely incompetent.
Strong words.
Yeah. This perspective, it doesn't just highlight the perceived ineffectiveness of this formidable security apparatus, but it also powerfully underscores the resilience, the resourcefulness, and maybe that unexpected solidarity that could emerge among some patients.
Finding ways to navigate, even subvert the system.
Exactly. It's like a testament to the enduring human capacity to find loopholes, to create these small pockets of agency, even under what sounds like extreme duress.
A survival mechanism.
Definitely. Okay, so the next segment, it unveils a pretty significant development. We fast forward to a global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. How did that play out inside?
You might instinctively assume a place like penal psychiatry or Blacksite Berlin would be just dramatically upended by something like COVID.
You'd think so. Maximum disruption.
But the buyer's experience, it paints a slightly different, maybe even paradoxical picture. It reveals the unique adaptability of an environment that was already highly controlled.
Interesting. How so?
The buyer observes that within the Blacksite, very little fundamentally changed during Germany's national lockdowns. Why? Because the patients there already lived, by default, in a shutdown-like state. That was their routine.
So the outside world caught up to their reality in a way.
Pretty much. The everyday reality of the Blacksite already mirrored many of the stringent restrictions imposed outside, which minimized the perceived impact of the external crisis within the walls.
So what did change then?
The key changes mostly focused on visit regulations, mandatory COVID tests, mask mandates for any visitors, strict group rules for gatherings, and forced social distancing protocols. Pretty standard stuff, actually.
Right.
Additionally, the AT-Arbeits therapy, the work therapy, was either completely suspended or segregated by station to prevent cross-contamination.
And did the patients lose pay for that?
Interestingly, no. Patients unable to attend work therapy still received their usual pay. The reasoning was it wasn't their fault, so they shouldn't suffer financially.
Okay, that's somewhat reasonable.
Another notable change involved the Hofgarten, the courtyard. Communal free time was restricted. Previously, multiple stations might use it together.
But now...
Now, each station got separate, staggered times to prevent any potential spread between groups. Further fragmentation, you could say.
Makes sense for infection control.
And a mask mandate was universally enforced outside cells and inside cells if visitors were present. Though the buyer observed that most patients only really adhered to this strictly for a few days.
Compliance issues.
Yeah, finding the masks uncomfortable or annoying, staff had to keep reminding them, and even then, compliance would lapse again pretty quickly.
Human nature, I suppose. Even there.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
But the buyer highlights a crucial point here. Despite all these internal restrictions, the real, persistent risk of infection for the patients came from those with Ausgänge.
The permitted trips outside?
Exactly. It was predominantly through these external contacts, when patients re-entered the Blacksite, that the virus was most likely to breach the facility's walls and get introduced into the contained population.
The outside connection again. It highlights that fascinating paradox, doesn't it? You have this highly controlled, supposedly isolated environment.
Right. Sealed off, you'd think.
Yet the primary vector for infection remains its, well, tenuous connection to the outside world through those patient outings. The inherent isolation probably slowed the initial entry and spread within the walls.
Delayed it, maybe?
Yeah, likely slowed it down. But once introduced by someone returning from an outing, the tightly confined nature of the facility meant the virus could then potentially spread rapidly and widely among the internal population.
Like wildfire in a closed space.
Exactly. It reveals this fundamental vulnerability in any closed system that still maintains even limited links to the outside. It shows how even the most stringent internal controls can be critically bypassed by external vectors.
True isolation is almost impossible.
Pretty much unattainable, and any breach can have really amplified consequences within that kind of restricted environment.
Okay, so what happened next takes a pretty dramatic turn. The real contagion risk, as we just discussed, did indeed come directly via patients returning from those authorized excursions.
Sealskin.
Yes. And this led to what the buyer vividly describes as the Great COVID-19 Outbreak.
The Great Outbreak. How bad was it?
More than half of all patients were infected simultaneously. That's a massive wave sweeping through the facility.
Wow. More than half.
The consequence was immediate and comprehensive. A complete 24/7 lockdown and quarantine for all patients, imposed for a full 14 days.
Total lockdown. How did that work logistically?
During that period, food and drinks were delivered by caretakers. They'd loudly announce their arrival by unlocking the airlock, giving patients enough time to get ready for the brief, distanced interaction.
Okay, standard quarantine procedure.
But what stands out most from the buyer's detailed account of this period is their truly unexpected and, frankly, maybe even disquieting reaction.
How did they react?
Despite the grim circumstances, widespread outbreak, total lockdown, the buyer found this period to be the best time ever.
The best time during a mass infection and lockdown.
That's what they said. The reason, profoundly telling. They were able to surf the internet freely without any fear of being caught. They enjoyed an undisturbed peace and sense of personal space they rarely, if ever, experienced.
So the lack of surveillance was a bigger relief than the lockdown was a burden.
Apparently so. The buyer openly stated that if it were up to them, this confinement could have lasted for the entire pandemic. That's how much they appreciated the reprieve.
That's incredible.
What was also really great for the buyer was that the staff, understandably trying to maintain distance because of the high contagion risk, kept interactions brief and minimal.
Less contact with staff.
Right. For the buyer, this translated into real relief. They hardly saw the staff, finally had some quiet, some genuine privacy. It's incredibly telling, isn't it, about the psychological cost of constant surveillance.
Absolutely. The buyer's reaction to the lockdown as a blessing offers this profound insight into what you might call paradoxical autonomy within these total institutions.
Paradoxical economy. Explain that.
Well, in an environment defined by constant surveillance, absolute control, that pervasive feeling of being perpetually watched, the forced isolation of the lockdown paradoxically created this temporary space, a space of perceived freedom and privacy from staff interference.
So the isolation was freedom from something worse.
It suggests exactly that. The relief from constant scrutiny, the ability to do things like surf the web without fear, even under the shadow of a pandemic. It seems to have outweighed the discomfort and health risks of the lockdown itself.
It highlights what was most oppressive for them.
Critically, it shows that when external control is so absolute, even a forced internal isolation can be reinterpreted as a form of liberation. It becomes a psychological refuge.
That's a powerful insight into their mindset.
It really compels us to consider how individual definitions of freedom can adapt and shift under extreme duress. You find solace in unexpected places.
Yeah. Okay, so the deep dive continues. There were further outbreaks after that big one.
Yes, the account mentions subsequent smaller outbreaks.
And these still necessitated stringent measures.
Apparently so. The containment protocol for these remained quite strict. Infected patients were immediately locked in their rooms.
And how did they know who was infected?
Visibly closed airlocks served as a clear, if maybe unsettling, indicator of who was currently infected and quarantined.
Right. And did vaccination prevent reinfection?
Interestingly, the buyer notes that some patients, despite having received 3 doses of the vaccine, still contracted COVID-19 3 separate times.
3 times, even triple vaxxed. Wow.
Yeah, it highlights the virus's persistent challenge, especially new variants, presumably. The buyer themselves contracted it a second time.
How were their symptoms the second time?
Mild flu-like symptoms, they report, with the most unpleasant symptom being a rather unusual one, and itching on the back of the eyeballs.
Itching eyeballs, that is specific.
Very specific.
And how did the buyer approach these subsequent outbreaks? Did their attitude change?
Their approach was actually quite provocative. They recount deliberately avoiding masks whenever possible.
Okay.
And, perhaps surprisingly, actively seeking reinfection.
Actively seeking it. Why on earth?
Their motivation, the hope of triggering another 14-day lockdown, and crucially, getting that undisturbed time and perceived privacy they had cherished so much during the first major outbreak.
Wow. Willing to get sick again for privacy. That's extreme.
It really underscores how valuable that lack of scrutiny felt to them.
And what about vaccination itself? Did the buyer get vaccinated?
Yes, they voluntarily received 3 doses of the Moderna vaccine and tolerated them well.
And their rationale.
This is fascinating. The buyer's explicit rationale for choosing Moderna was based on trust in AI. They were immediately enthusiastic upon learning it was reportedly developed by AI in just 3 days.
Developed by AI.
That's the claim reported. And that the mRNA vaccine was deemed safe after a 9-month test phase. The buyer explicitly states, and this is a direct quote paraphrase, "I simply trust AI more than people."
Trust AI over human developers.
Yes. Finding specific comfort in the idea that the vaccine was rolled out in the exact form developed by AI, supposedly unchanged by human intervention. That was their reasoning.
The unique perspective on vaccine trust.
It certainly is. And this brings us to a crucial point about the varying perspectives and the flow of information within the Blacksite, particularly regarding beliefs about vaccination.
Were there divisions?
Yes. The source material highlights the presence of radical vaccine opponents among both patients and staff.
Staff, too, okay.
These individuals, according to the buyer, steadfastly refused vaccination, and the buyer states they actively propagated what the buyer describes as crude conspiracy myths and nonsensical conspiracy theories and vaccine myths.
What kind of myths?
Beliefs that vaccination would lead to death or cause COVID-19 infection itself, that the pandemic was planned for chipping humanity, various connections to figures like Bill Gates, those sorts of narratives.
Okay, the common ones we heard about.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, it's really important for us to note here that the source material clearly attributes these particular beliefs and the characterization of them as crude and nonsensical directly to the buyer's perspective on these radical vaccine opponents.
Right, that's the buyer's framing of it.
Yes. And the buyer also highlights a significant distinction regarding information access.
How so?
Blacksite staff, with their internet access, were able to engage with and potentially propagate these ideas. In contrast, most patients without phones remain largely unaffected by such narratives.
So access to outside information was key.
It appears so. The buyer notes that even among the few patients who did have phones, many were more interested in other things online rather than these theories.
Okay.
Only 1 or 2 patients on the buyer's station outright refused vaccination, apparently. The vast majority willingly received the shots.
So not a widespread refusal among patients then?
Not according to this account, but it paints this vivid picture of internal division and how information access, or the lack of it, significantly shaped beliefs and behaviors within the confines of Blacksite Berlin, at least from the buyer's vantage point. It shows that complex interplay of information, isolation, and personal conviction.
Yeah, fascinating dynamics within those walls. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Moving from the day-to-day existence and the pandemic's unique impact, let's delve into the bureaucratic and legal aspects that, according to the buyer, govern their continued stay in this penal psychiatry.
The system itself.
Exactly. And what we encounter here, based on the account, is frankly bewildering. It describes a system seemingly designed to maintain confinement through procedural means.
How so? What's the first example?
The buyer recounts receiving their first psychological report in 2023. This is a formidable document, apparently around 120 pages long.
120 pages, okay.
And their description of this report is, well, scathing. They label it complete nonsense, slander, and outright lies.
Strong condemnation.
Very. The buyer went further, calling the report a professional insult and stating emphatically that the expert who wrote it was a real professional defamer.
So they felt personally attacked by it.
Deeply. The buyer meticulously observed that the report was filled with dense, pseudoscientific jargon, complex psychological terminology.
Obfuscation, perhaps?
In their view, yes. Merely a sophisticated facade, skillfully constructed to mask its inherent falsity and serve a singular predetermined purpose. To justify continued confinement, to enable forced medication, and potentially even to establish guardianship, Betreuung, over the buyer.
And how was the report compiled? Did they interview the buyer?
That's a critical detail. According to the buyer, this specific report, like all previous ones they'd encountered, was based purely on existing files. Aktenlage, the German term is.
Based only on the file, no direct interaction.
No direct interviews, no personal conversations with the buyer themselves. That's the claim. And the buyer firmly believes these files originated from the bad guys.
The bad.
Their term. containing fabricated or manipulated information specifically designed by the perpetrators, another term they use to officially declare them insane and thereby legitimize their ongoing detention.
So the foundation of the report is seen as corrupt.
Entirely. Now, adding another layer, the buyer makes this striking assertion. They claim to possess diplomatic status.
Diplomatic status, how does that factor in?
This status, in their view, grants them the legal right to be, and I quote loosely, as crazy as I want. The implication being that even if a diagnosis of insanity were objectively true, their diplomatic immunity should render it irrelevant to their confinement.
So a challenge to the facility's jurisdiction based on status.
Exactly. For the buyer, the real question isn't about their mental state in a clinical sense. It's more like, am I crazy enough for this number? Implying this cynical calculation by the system about what level of perceived craziness is needed for legally defensible confinement.
A performative aspect to the diagnosis, almost.
That's how they seem to frame it. And the buyer states, unequivocally, the entire situation is completely illegal.
Okay. And access to these documents, could they study them?
This is interesting, too. The buyer received that initial lengthy psychological report for review, but was apparently compelled to return it on the very same day.
Same day. That's not much time for 120 pages.
No. It severely limits any ability to thoroughly scrutinize its contents. However, a separate report, specifically concerning forced medication, was received days later. And that one, surprisingly, the buyer was permitted to keep a copy of.
Selective access. That's curious. Why allow one and not the other?
Right. It raises questions about transparency, selective disclosure, the subtle mechanisms of control at play within the system, as described.
Yeah, this whole account of the psychological reports is incredibly telling, particularly in how individuals experience and perceive institutional power.
It feels very much like instruments of control, not care.
Exactly. The buyer perceives these assessments not as objective evaluations, but as tools explicitly designed to legitimize ongoing confinement and forced medication. That's their unwavering perspective.
And the diplomatic status claim.
That claim, from the buyer's viewpoint, frames their situation as one where even perceived insanity shouldn't negate fundamental rights. It highlights this profound clash with the facility's authority and its legal jurisdiction.
A fundamental disagreement on who has power.
Precisely. And the assertion that these reports were based solely on, quote, bad guys' files, without any direct interaction. That raises serious questions about due process, about the integrity of the diagnostic process itself.
If it's just based on files you believe are fake.
Right. When evaluations are perceived as based purely on pre-existing, potentially manipulated documentation rather than direct clinical assessment, it fundamentally undermines the credibility and fairness of the whole justification for confinement.
Erodes trust completely.
Absolutely. It reinforces the individual's sense of powerlessness against the system's narrative. It creates this chasm between the institutional reality or the presented reality and the individual's lived experience.
Okay, the next detail the buyer recounts is, well, it truly surprised us. It's an alarming detail about their forced medication that points to a deeply concerning revelation regarding alleged guardianship.
Guardianship again, how does it connect to the medication?
The report specifically concerning the forced medication. The buyer received it a staggering 4.5 years after the very first forced medication injection was administered.
4.5 years later, they were getting injections for years before getting the paperwork justifying it.
That's the timeline described. This significant, unexplained delay in providing documentation about such a profound, invasive intervention is, well, highly unusual. Ethically dubious, to say the least.
That's putting it mildly. That's shocking.
But the real shock, according to the buyer, came when a psychologist allegedly let slip a crucial piece of information during a conversation.
Oh, was it?
That the buyer was simultaneously placed under Betreuung guardianship at the same time as the forced medication was initiated. In eine Rush, the German phrase implies all at once, part of a single orchestrated process.
So forced medication and guardianship imposed together covertly.
That's the allegation.
Yeah.
But despite this alleged placement, the buyer insists they never received any official written notification of this guardianship. Zero paperwork.
No notification? How did they react when they heard this from the psychologist?
They pressed the psychologist for more details a few days later. And the reaction. The psychologist immediately denied ever having made the statement.
Backtracking. Classic denial.
And then some. What followed, according to the buyer, was a disturbing and rapid shift in demeanor. The psychologist became highly emotional, went into what the buyer described as attack mode.
Attack mode for asking for clarification.
Yes, and then threatened the buyer with long-term isolation if they dared to repeat the claim about the simultaneous guardianship.
Threatening isolation for repeating what they allegedly said. That's wow.
The buyer interpreted this intense reaction as proof of an accidental revelation that the psychologist was now desperately trying to cover up, fearing potential consequences for their slip-up.
It certainly sounds like an overreaction if nothing was said.
And the buyer points out the striking incongruity of the threat itself. Isolation is typically reserved for self-harm or acute danger to others, right?
Right. Not for asking a polite question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not for a politely phrased question, posed with a smile, apparently, seeking clarification. The conversation then took another odd turn.
What happened?
The psychologist then asked if the buyer had ever been under guardianship before. After a brief silence, the psychologist emphatically stated, "No, you've certainly never been supervised before."
An overly strong denial, perhaps.
A statement that the buyer profoundly distrusts, given the previous alleged slip and the psychologist's extreme defensive reaction. This entire exchange suggests, from the buyer's viewpoint, a clandestine aspect to their legal status, with staff actively working to obscure or deny a significant truth.
Yeah, that narrative, particularly the psychologist's alleged slip and then the aggressive denial, it really points to a potential pattern of deliberate obfuscation, maybe even an abuse of power.
The threat of isolation seems key there.
Absolutely. Threatening long-term isolation for merely asking a question about a seemingly accidental revelation. It speaks volumes about the control dynamics within that environment.
It implies some truths are dangerous to even mention.
It suggests exactly that certain truths are so highly guarded that even inquiring about them can trigger severe punitive responses. It reinforces the institution's absolute authority and the individual's vulnerability.
So from the buyer's perspective,
From the buyer's perspective, this indicates not just a lack of transparency, but active concealment of crucial legal information. It fundamentally undermines trust and any semblance of due process. This dynamic, unfortunately, is often a hallmark of systems where accountability is severely compromised and individual rights are systematically eroded.
okay, so this alleged slip about guardianship, it wasn't the only reason the buyer suspected this was happening behind their back, right?
No, not at all. This is where the narrative really takes a turn. The buyer details multiple concrete pieces of information that, from their perspective, strongly suggest a patrum, a guardianship, is in place or was in place without their knowledge.
Not just suspicions, but specific points.
Exactly. These aren't vague feelings. They are specific incidents and document references that weave together a really complex picture of alleged hidden guardianship.
Okay, let's break these down. What's the first point?
First, the buyer recounts the unsettling discovery of what they claim was a forged signature.
A forged signature. On what?
On an alleged judicial summons. A summons from a district court, which notably is where the guardianship court is located.
And how did they find this?
Purely by chance. The buyer was signing for a different summons in a logbook on Station 10A and just happened to notice this other entry with the suspicious signature.
Wow.
Just stumbled upon it. That's a major red flag, a huge red flag. Direct physical evidence suggesting potential manipulation of legal documents.
Okay, what's the second point?
Secondly, remember that first psychological report the buyer received in writing, the 120-pager from 2023.
Yes, the one they had to return the same day.
That one. In that very report, there was apparently a direct, undeniable reference to a betrayer act,
Which means?
a guardianship file. Logically, as the buyer acutely observes, such a file would only exist if guardianship is currently in place or was in place at some point.
So the report itself mentioned a guardianship file.
Explicitly referenced it, according to the account. This documented reference provides clear internal institutional acknowledgement, seemingly contradicting the complete lack of official notification to the buyer.
That's pretty damning if true. Okay, third point.
Thirdly, years prior, while the buyer was still free, not confined, they reportedly received two separate notifications. Notifications of the Niederlegung der Betreuung.
Which means termination of guardianship.
Exactly, termination of guardianship. But here's the kicker. The buyer insists they had never been informed that a guardianship existed in the first place, nor were they ever told who their guardian supposedly was.
So they got notice it ended, but never knew it began.
Precisely. A termination notice inherently implies that a guardianship must have been in effect until that point. This left the buyer profoundly baffled and deeply concerned by the total lack of prior communication about such a significant legal status.
Mind-boggling. Okay. Fourth point.
Fourth, an application for guardianship was reportedly filed back in Zweibrücken. And in connection with this, a criminal fantasy report, that's the buyer's term, was allegedly created.
By whom?
By what the buyer refers to as a criminal doctor at the University of Hamburg in Saarland.
And this report.
This report, according to the buyer, astonishingly recommended guardianship without the doctor ever physically seeing the buyer or their mother.
Recommended guardianship without an examination. How?
Seemingly, as ordered by the perpetrators, is the buyer's explanation. This suggests a process where critical legal recommendations were made without any direct professional assessment, appearing instead to be based purely on external directives. It fundamentally compromises the integrity of that whole process.
Sounds like rubber stamping from afar. Fifth point.
Fifth, the buyer states that their and their mother's alleged guardianship was even reported in the press in Zweibrücken.
It made the newspapers.
Apparently so. But despite this public dissemination of the information, no judicial decision was ever officially communicated to them in writing by a court.
So it's in the public domain, but they never get official notice.
That's the claim. The absence of formal written notification from the courts, even as the information supposedly appeared in public discourse, adds another opaque layer of secrecy. It indicates a deliberate withholding of vital legal information from the subjects themselves.
Okay, and there's a sixth point, too.
Yes, finally, sixth, a notary in permissons.
A notary.
Yes, whom the buyer describes as an obvious double agent who had previously intervened to prevent the transfer of rights from the buyer's contract to Germany.
Okay, complicated backstory there.
Right. This same notary allegedly filed a guardianship application against both the buyer and their mother,
And the timing.
reportedly directly after an alleged murder attempt on the mother.
Wait, a guardianship application filed right after an alleged murder attempt on the person involved
Yeah,
by a notary described as a double agent.
that's the sequence of events described. This disturbing connection linking a legal professional, a prior contract issue with potential international implications, and an alleged violent crime, it further complicates the narrative of guardianship. It suggests a broader, intertwined network of actions allegedly taken against the buyer and their family. It paints this picture of deeply entrenched systemic control.
Wow, that is a lot of converging points.
It really is. And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, these numerous, seemingly disparate instances.
Forged signatures, file references, termination notices, the doctor's report, press coverage, the notary.
Exactly. All of them together paint this compelling picture from the buyer's perspective of a systematic, covert process designed to establish and maintain guardianship over them.
It makes their question really hit home.
Which question?
Why were these apparently existing guardianship proceedings never communicated to me? It becomes this central critical inquiry, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's the core mystery from their viewpoint. And the alleged involvement of a notary, a criminal doctor, making recommendations without assessment. It further complicates the legal and ethical dimensions. It suggests, again, from the buyer's perspective, a deeply entrenched, possibly corrupt system operating outside conventional legal norms.
A system creating its own rules for them.
It forces us to consider the implications of such opaque legal maneuvers on an individual's autonomy, their fundamental rights. It highlights how a system could potentially create a kind of parallel legal reality for an individual completely hidden from them.
So with all these pieces pointing towards a hidden guardianship, what did the buyer think the motive was? Why go to all this alleged trouble?
Right, the why behind it all. The buyer speculates that there must have been not just one, but several guardianship proceedings concerning both themselves and their mother,
Over a long period.
potentially spanning decades. This suggests a long-term, sustained, highly coordinated effort to exert control over their lives, according to this view.
But control over what specifically?
That's the key question the buyer raises. What was being managed? What specific aspects of their life or their mother's life would necessitate such an extensive and covert guardianship? The answer isn't provided, only the question.
And the Blacksite context made it easier, they thought.
Yes. The buyer notes that the very context of the Blacksite itself makes the idea more plausible in their mind. Many patients within penal psychiatry settings do have guardians, just by the nature of their situations.
So it wouldn't necessarily raise eyebrows internally.
That's the reasoning. It would potentially make it significantly easier to impose guardianship on a Blacksite patient without triggering immediate suspicion or external scrutiny.
And the ultimate perceived advantage for the perpetrators.
From the buyer's perspective, such a secret guardianship could grant these nefarious actors profound control over crucial financial transactions, legal matters, personal decisions, basically total control.
A tempting prospect for someone wanting leverage.
Exactly. The buyer firmly believes this would be a very tempting prospect for those allegedly involved in this manipulation, offering them significant leverage and power over the lives of both the buyer and their mother. It would cement a system of pervasive, hidden control.
Okay, so despite all this, years of confinement, the control, these deeply unsettling legal maneuvers, did the buyer still hold out hope for release?
Remarkably, yes, the account describes a persistent hope for release, an unwavering optimism, even as a new, insidious, and harrowing challenge emerges, one that threatens the most basic well-being.
How did this hope manifest?
The buyer describes the annual review for release as this recurrent moment of intense anticipation every year.
The hearing, the Anhörungsturm.
Right. Despite often contradicting all logical expectations based on past experiences, the buyer harbors hope for release every single year when the continuation of their confinement is reviewed.
Even though they couldn't attend the hearings.
Even without being permitted to personally appear, they remain physically absent from the proceedings that determine their fate. As the buyer puts it, quite powerfully, hope dies last. A testament to resilience, certainly.
Definitely. And in 2023, this hope was particularly high. Why? Because of a crucial legal benchmark, the proportionality review.
Ah, the check after 10 years.
Exactly. 10 years of confinement plus pre-trial detention, totaling around 12 years by then. This specific review is supposedly a stringent legal check, meant to critically reassess the necessity, the ethical proportionality, of keeping someone locked up after such a significant period.
So a real chance, legally speaking.
That was the hope. But for the buyer, this hope was once again dashed. The proportionality argument was rejected. The buyer remained in the Blacksite.
Another rejection after 12 years.
Yeah. This repeated cycle of anticipation and disappointment, it just underscores the profound psychological burden of indefinite detention, where even these statutory reviews, designed to offer a potential pass out, ultimately offer no guarantee. It constantly resets the clock on hope, reinforcing that sense of entrapment.
And that repeated cycle, hope, followed by rejection, especially after a significant statutory review like the 10-year proportionality check.
Yeah.
It can have really profound psychological effects. It often reinforces a sense of powerlessness. It can lead to what psychologists sometimes call learned helplessness.
Where you just give up trying.
Exactly. Because past efforts have consistently proven futile, yet despite this, the buyer notably maintains hope, which highlights, as you said, a remarkable individual resilience in the face of systemic disappointment.
It's a complex dynamic.
Very. This interaction between a rigid, seemingly arbitrary legal process and the enduring human spirit, it provides a stark illustration of the complex psychological landscape within such a facility. It forces us to consider the long-term mental toll of perpetual uncertainty and the individual's desperate clinging to the possibility of freedom, even when the system consistently denies it.
Yeah. Okay, but then the plot thickens significantly, right? After years of what the buyer describes as the hellish torment of forced medication.
Right, the injections.
Their ordeal takes an even darker, more insidious turn. They describe the discovery of alleged poisoning.
Poisoning, beyond the forced medication.
Yes. The buyer recounts that after more than 4 long years, the injections finally came to an end.
That must have been a huge relief.
Undoubtedly.
No.
But the effects didn't just vanish overnight. It took several months for what the buyer referred to explicitly as the poison from the depot injection, the depot spritz, to fully leave their body.
A slow withdrawal.
Yes. With its unbearable effects gradually fading over weeks and months. A slow, agonizing process of detoxification, as they describe it.
Okay, and then?
Approximately 2 weeks after finally feeling right normal again. And this was despite a doctor apparently commenting that the medication would still be detectable in the blood for up to 6 months. The buyer experienced something alarming. A strong backflash medicated shub.
A backflash? What did that feel like?
It felt, according to the account, as if they had taken the exact same dose of the medication again. It resulted in 20 hours of complete exhaustion, profound sleep, and all the familiar, unpleasant side effects they had come to dread.
20 hours? That's intense. And did it stop after that?
No, in the days immediately following, this unsettling feeling didn't abate. And interestingly, Blacksite staff then started asking the buyer, hypocritically, in the buyer's view, if they still felt the effects of the medication.
Even though it had been officially stopped weeks before.
Yes, 10 weeks prior by then. The buyer, choosing truthfulness despite suspecting manipulation, confirmed that yes, they did indeed still feel the medication's pervasive influence.
So the staff seemed aware of lingering effects.
That exchange highlights the staff's apparent awareness, or at least their inquiry into it, and the buyer's acute, almost hypersensitivity to their own physical state and any perceived chemical alteration.
Yeah, that description of the backlash is particularly significant here.
Why so?
Well, while some medications, especially depot injections, can certainly have lingering effects and withdrawal symptoms, the intensity described by the buyer feeling like the full dose was readministered months after cessation, that's noteworthy and concerning.
It signals something unusual.
It signals a heightened state of awareness of their own bodily sensations and acute sensitivity to any perceived chemical influence. And this experience is critical because it immediately sets the stage for the buyer's growing suspicion of new external sources of medication.
Not the injections anymore, but something else.
Exactly. It marks an alarming escalation from the previous known, institutionally administered forced injections. It shifts the narrative from internally controlled medication to a perceived external contamination. And that marks a truly chilling turn in their prolonged confinement and their fight for bodily autonomy.
So what were the consequences of this new lingering sensation? Where did they think it was coming from now?
The turning point in the buyer's understanding, according to the account, came from an unexpected source.
Yeah,
A subtle, cautious hint from another patient.
another patient gave them a clue.
Yes, this patient, who took no medication at all, tentatively suggested that his carbonated-free water bottle might have been laced at some point. It led him to exclusively drink tap water ever since.
Oh, wow.
This seemingly small detail was a crucial lead. The buyer, who hadn't previously considered water as a potential vector for medication, immediately felt compelled to investigate.
Okay, so how did they investigate the water?
Well, at dinner, patients had daily access to 2 types of 1-liter water bottles. Red label for still water, blue label for carbonated, and they could take as many as they wanted.
And the buyer's habit.
They habitually took 2 red and 5 blue bottles, a consistent daily ritual. Following the hint from the other patient, the red, still water bottles immediately fell under suspicion.
Makes sense. The other patient mentioned still water.
Exactly. So the buyer then spent several days discreetly observing the water distribution during dinner, carefully watching who took which bottles.
And what did they notice?
It quickly became clear the red bottles were markedly unpopular. Apart from the buyer, only one other patient regularly took them.
Just one other person.
Yes. And this other patient, significantly, was already on 10 strong medications daily, which would make it virtually impossible for him to discern if an 11th substance had been added to his water.
Right, you wouldn't be able to tell with all that already in your system.
As the buyer astutely noted, if you're taking 10 powerful meds, you can't accurately attribute effects to any specific one, let alone detect an 11th.
So armed with this observation, what did the buyer do?
They decided to conduct a self-experiment. Very simply, they stopped drinking from the red bottles altogether.
And the result?
Within a mere few days, the medication effects they had been experiencing significantly decreased. It offered a profound sense of relief.
A noticeable difference just from stopping the red water.
A quick and noticeable difference, and the buyer highlights a crucial physiological point here. Unlike depot injections with their prolonged effects, orally ingested medication effects typically dissipate quickly after you stop taking them.
So the rapid improvement pointed directly to the water.
Strongly suggested a direct, immediate link. Now, to maintain deception, to prevent the poison mixers, the buyer's term, from noticing their change in behavior.
You kept taking the red bottles?
Shrewdly, yes. They continued to collect their 2 red bottles daily for a few weeks, creating the illusion of continued consumption. Then, for definitive verification, they conducted a final test.
What was the test?
They drank 1 red bottle again, after weeks of avoiding it.
Yeah.
The result was immediate and profound. Quote, "Bang! Again, I was sedated. Wow." That's pretty conclusive from their perspective. It unequivocally confirmed the buyer's suspicions in their mind. And the buyer expressed intense outrage at this insidious tactic, finding it outrageous that other innocent patients were apparently being poisoned just to covertly target them. It indicated to the buyer a complete and ruthless disregard for the well-being of the entire station.
Okay, so they believe they confirmed the red bottles were poisoned. What happened next? Did the alleged poisoning stop there?
No, unfortunately not. The situation with the water, as described, rapidly escalated. It forced the buyer into this relentless cat-and-mouse game for access to unadulterated hydration.
So after confirming the red bottles were tainted?
The buyer wondered just how far they, meaning the alleged perpetrators, would go. If red bottles were no longer being consumed by them, would they switch to the blue bottles? Would they potentially poison the entire station indiscriminately? Or would they back off?
A critical question. How did they test it?
In a defiant, calculated act, the buyer began taking only blue carbonated bottles, signaling their awareness, their resistance.
Okay, sending a message and the result.
Days later, the grim answer arrived, according to the account. The blue bottles were also allegedly contaminated.
The carbonated ones, too. They went that far.
The buyer found it unbelievable, expressed profound shock, accusing completely broken Blacksite employees of ruthlessly poisoning the entire station. This marked, in their view, a shocking and deeply concerning escalation, from targeted medication to widespread, indiscriminate action affecting the entire patient population.
That's a huge leap. And how did the buyer react then? Did they stop taking blue bottles?
To maintain their deception, to try and ensure the alleged poison supply continued to be distributed to others, a grim strategy, the buyer cleverly varied the time of their water collection. They carefully pretended to still consume the blue water.
Why pretend?
Presumably to avoid alerting the poison mixers that they knew both types were now compromised, perhaps fearing an even worse escalation. After confirming the blue water was also contaminated through their own consumption, the buyer exclusively switched to drinking tap water.
Tap water became the only option.
Yes, yet they continued to collect the blue bottles daily, stating this was done to ensure others continued to be poisoned alongside them. It highlights the extreme level of desperation, the grim, almost cynical calculus needed to survive in that utterly controlled environment as they saw it. Wow, That's a really dark strategy born of desperation.
It is. And this whole account, from the buyer's perspective, it escalates to a truly chilling degree, weaponizing a basic human need, hydration.
And the buyer explicitly references German legal perspectives here, categorizing the alleged acts as vorsätzliche gemeingefährliche Vergiftung.
Intentional public poisoning.
Right, under Section 314 StGB, a criminal offense. And also gefährliche Körperverletzung durch Einbringen von Gift oder anderen gesundheitsschädlichen Wirkstoffen.
Dangerous bodily harm by introducing poison.
Yes, punishable by up to 10 years under Section 227 CGB. This legal framing by the buyer really underlines the immense severity of what's being described. Not just a personal affront, but grave criminal acts in their view.
It elevates it beyond just mistreatment.
Absolutely. And the progression described, from targeted forced medication via injections, then allegedly hidden in individual water bottles, to the purported mass poisoning of the entire station's general water supply. It paints this chilling picture, an environment where even basic necessities like drinking water are systematically weaponized.
It feels systemic.
The systemic nature of the alleged acts impacting an entire confined population suggests a profound level of calculated malice and disregard for life, at least from the buyer's perspective. It showcases the ultimate extension of control over fundamental human needs.
So what were the consequences of this escalating struggle for clean water? Did the tap water remain safe?
Well, the situation took an even more drastic turn. New station-wide water rules were implemented, which seemed, from the buyer's viewpoint, designed to further corner them.
New rules. What were they?
First, water distribution was severely restricted. Only patients who were on the clinic's provided food plan, the clinic cost, would receive bottled water.
And the buyer wasn't on that plan?
No, they were self-catering at the time. So officially, they were completely cut off from the clinic's bottled water supply.
Okay, so that forces them towards the tap. What else?
Secondly, a strict quantity limit. Only one liter bottle of water per day was now allowed for those who did qualify.
Just 1 liter a day. That's very little.
Very restrictive. And it effectively prevented patients from sharing water with others. It isolated each individual's supply, making any collective resistance or mutual support impossible.
Divides and conquers, almost.
That's one interpretation. Thirdly, the distribution method changed. A full week's supply, 7 one-liter bottles, was now distributed all at once under controlled conditions on a single designated day.
Okay, batch distribution.
So these new, tightly controlled rules meant the buyer was now officially forced to drink tap water exclusively. It brought their intricate hide-and-seek game with the bottled water to an abrupt, conclusive end.
No more pretending. And ordering water wasn't an option.
No, the buyer firmly believed the Secret Service poison mixers could easily manipulate sealed bottles during the 24-hour delivery window for clinic orders, making any delivered drinks untrustworthy.
Plus the quantity issue.
Right. The buyer states they consume at least 7 liters of fluids daily. Ordering that much, potentially contaminated, water wasn't feasible. It would just clutter their small cell and waste money.
And the staff knew they weren't ordering.
Yes. Since orders were facilitated by staff who were fully aware the buyer wasn't placing any, it became explicitly clear to everyone involved the buyer's only remaining singular water source was now the tap.
Nowhere left to turn for water, seemingly. And then
The final terrifying escalation occurred. The buyer's worst nightmares, as they described them, came true.
what happened with the tap water?
Days later, for about 2 hours, the water on the station was cut off. The official reason given was maintenance. Maintenance. Always suspicious in these contexts, exactly. Afterwards, when the buyer, ever vigilant, dared to use the bathroom tap again, their deepest fears were realized. It was, in their words, a full blast, full droning of a sedative.
The tap water itself was now drugged.
That's the claim. The buyer, already familiar with this insidious game, moved to the tap in the community kitchen. Did that work? Only for that source to be allegedly poisoned a few days later as well. Undeterred, desperate, they then tried another bathroom down the hall, always carrying a bag with 6 1.5-liter plastic bottles to quickly fill them without drawing suspicion.
But even that source.
Even that alternative source quickly became unpalatable after just a few days. The buyer describes this as an accelerated process. Every potential alternative water source being systematically taken away, one after another, in rapid succession.
Closing in on them. Was there anywhere left?
In a desperate last resort, the buyer remembered one specific tap. A tap that had miraculously remained safe during a previous similar experience on Station 10A. A tap located in the laundry room.
The laundry room tap or the shot?
Taking extreme precautions disguised with dirty laundry, hiding empty bottles in a plastic bag underneath. The buyer clandestinely snuck into the laundry room pretending to do laundry. They managed to draw water from this last seemingly safe source.
Please tell me this one was okay.
The shock and bitter disappointment came later, back in their cell, upon drinking the water. It, too, was already contaminated.
Even the laundry room tap. Oh, no.
The buyer bitterly concluded that the dogs had learned, implying the perpetrators had adapted their tactics, anticipated this move. With seemingly no other options for clean water nearby, the buyer then considered a desperate, drastic plan.
What was it?
To obtain water from a public patient bathroom on the opposite side of the station, hoping it was connected to a different water supply line altogether.
A long shot, but maybe the only one left. Did it work?
After successfully obtaining drinkable water from this new, supposedly safe source, a few days later, the buyer suddenly felt that familiar, dreaded sensation again.
Not the water this time.
No. They were lying in bed, middle of the day, hadn't eaten yet, drinking from a bottle they'd already half consumed the previous day, confirming it was safe. Yet at that precise moment, they felt acutely sedated.
So if it wasn't the water, what was it?
This indicated to the buyer a terrifying and immediate shift in method. Instead of poisoning all the water sources, the Secret Service, as the buyer calls them, had allegedly decided to switch tactics entirely.
To what?
To directly gassing the buyer within their cell.
Gassing them in their room? How?
The account doesn't specify the mechanisms, just the experience. This horrific gassing became a daily torment, continuing every single day, with the timing deliberately varied to prevent any escape or prediction.
Unpredictable attacks.
Yes. Once the debilitating effects were felt, it was already too late to flee the room. As the buyer put it, you were already on it, rendered helpless.
If they do anything, open a window.
They did attempt to mitigate it, kept the small cell window open all day, but apparently it provided insufficient fresh air to counter the persistent chemical assault.
Constant attacks, no escape. The psychological effect.
Must have been immense. This constant targeted gassing led to an intense, consuming anger. And, as the buyer recounts, the forging of specific plans for revenge.
Revenge against whom?
Against the psychologists and caretakers, whom they held primarily responsible as the visible agents of the system. The elusive Secret Service agents remained in the background, out of reach, unidentifiable, so the immediate, tangible targets of their anger became the Blacksite staff themselves.
Wow. What an incredibly intense and deeply disturbing deep dive this has been.
It really has. The narrative arc is just staggering.
From a decade of denied family visits, those highly surveilled encounters, then the COVID lockdown, offering that unexpected paradoxical solace.
Right, the freedom within confinement.
And then shifting to this relentless, systematic struggle against alleged poisoning, first targeted, then widespread, and finally culminating in alleged targeted gassing.
It's an extraordinary account.
The Byers account is just this powerful testament to an individual's fight for agency, for survival within what sounds like an utterly controlled environment, a journey through a landscape of described psychological manipulation and profound physical threat.
And this entire narrative, compels us to reflect on some critical questions, doesn't it? About institutional power, individual resilience.
Definitely.
In systems that, according to the buyer, function under this cloak of an international deep state, where transparency is apparently absent and fundamental rights are allegedly ignored, the boundaries of control can become terrifyingly fluid.
The rules seem to change constantly, designed to entrap.
And the buyer's detailed account, the extreme lengths they allegedly went to in their fight for just clean water, for mental clarity, it forces us to confront the profound resilience of the human spirit in the face of such extreme adversity.
It's hard to imagine enduring that.
So, as you, the listener, reflect on the buyer's harrowing journey through Blacksite Berlin, as they've described it, maybe consider this. What does this account tell us about the nature of power, about transparency, about personal liberty when individuals are trapped within systems allegedly operating beyond conventional legal or ethical oversight?
Systems with personnel purportedly acting on behalf of multiple covert state interests.
Exactly. It's a question that resonates far beyond the walls of the specific facility, doesn't it? It touches upon the very foundations of individual sovereignty and the potential for hidden structures of control, something to really think about.